food should be a joy, but I want to make sure I'm also feeding this army that I know that if you nourish right, will look after you.
What are some red flags when it comes to claims around gut health and health more broadly?
This concept that we should all take a probiotic for our general gut health is completely unscientific. Ask that company, has there been a randomized controlled trial?
You mentioned a recent study linking eating citrus fruit with lower rates of depression.
Those who had the citrus fruit seem to be at about a 20% lower risk of developing depression.
Feels like we're learning so much stuff that could be really translated to very practical advice for people.
It is literally a landmark scientific discovery that's changing what it means to be human and how we can really maximize our health and our happiness.
Megan Rossi, thank you so much for being here today. So you are a gut health research scientist at King's College London, you are the author of multiple books on gut health, and you are the founder of the Gut Health Clinic. Why is the gut linked with better health and well-being and happiness?
Yeah, look, I think there's three main reasons, right, why gut health is important for everyone. So the good old digestive system. So we think of the gut, it's actually this 9-meter long tube that delivers food from entry all the way to exit. So that is gut health, right? And along that, obviously, is where digestion happens. So no matter how healthy the food you put into your body is, if you don't have good gut lining, it can't get from your gut into your blood system to feed all your other organs, like your brain, your heart, etc. So that's the obvious one. The other thing is that 70% of our immune system lives along that 9-meter digestive tract. I'm sure we'll talk about it at some stage, but it's such a hot topic, the link between having better gut health and having a more resilient immune system because they live together. But it's really the third element that's certainly what I did my PhD in and kind of what's brought the fame to this whole area. And that is these trillions of microorganisms, which we know as our gut microbiome is the scientific name.
If somebody is kind of beginning, let's say, their journey into bolstering their gut health, where would you urge people to begin? What are kind of 3 basic things you would ask everyone to do to dial up their gut health?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And when we think about those trillions of microbes, they need to be fed, essentially. So what we feed them and what we feed our bodies kind of dictates the types of microbes that live in our body and also what they're actually doing for our body. Because we know these microbes actually can influence pretty much every organ through the different chemicals they're producing and the messages. So what we feed them essentially dictates kind of the types of messages they're being, sent. So diet is one really important one, and we see people eat more different types and diversity of plants. When we talk about plants, I'm not just talking about your fruit and veg. I think, that obviously is the government guidelines, but our team at King's is actually trying to investigate and look at actually what about the other types of plants. So I call them the Super Six. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Claudia, and get you to tell me. So they're the whole grains, your nuts and seeds, your fruit, your veg, your legumes, and your herbs and your spices. And what we see is each different category actually provides our body with not just different nutrients, but different types of these plant chemicals like phytochemicals, which feed different types of gut bacteria. Right? So we think trying to get not just, your fruit in or your veggies in, but thinking about, can I add some legumes to my diet is probably a really, helpful way to bolster that gut health. So diet is obviously a really important one. Stress. I think it's kind of an overlooked one where people like, certainly in clinic, people say, I just want to focus on my diet. I'm like, absolutely, and we can really improve your gut health that way, but you can't have ultimate gut health without focusing on the other elements like the stress and the sleep and the body movement. So I think that's another really important thing that people need to keep in mind. It's not just diet, it's the other pillars of health as well.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. Obviously, intuitively, you assume that, gut health and diet are like the kind of sole highway, but like you mentioned, there's stress. How do you think people who say, hey, I would love to be less stressed, however, life is stressful, what are the kind of things you would advise they do to dial back their stress?
Yeah, look, amen to that. Life is really stressful, right? And I think, we need to obviously just focus what's in our control, right? We can't quit our jobs and all go travel the world and that sort of thing. But there's a number of different strategies. When we think about, I guess, the connection between stress and the gut, it really comes down to these, hundreds of millions of nerves that connect the two, called the enteric nervous system. So if you are stressed up here, what happens is those nerves, I think of them kind of like live wires. They literally strangle the gut. right? So no matter what you eat and what you're doing, your gut feels really tense and you get malabsorption and you might get stomach upset, altered bowel movements and bloating and those sorts of things. So one of the strategies we see in clinical trials is looking at things like diaphragmatic breathing, so things like belly breathing. So instead of breathing through your chest, breathing through your belly can really help kind of relax that enteric nervous system, so it's not strangling the gut as much. And there's also other clinical trials looking at things like gut-directed yoga flow, and actually that can help, reduce down that stress between the gut and the brain.
I just started doing belly breathing when you said that, and I already feel better. So thanks for that, Megan. Megan, I saw on your socials that you mentioned a recent study linking eating citrus fruit with lower rates of depression. And I was like, that is fascinating. Can you fill us in on that study? What are we learning?
Yeah, look, every week there's a new study coming out, which is why I'm just so passionate about this space. But that specific study was from Harvard. And what they did is they took over 30,000 women and they showed a correlation, so a link between women who ate citrus foods on the daily, so things like an orange or grapefruit, compared to those who ate citrus fruits less than once a week. And what they showed is those who had the citrus fruit, they seemed to be at about a 20% lower risk of developing depression, right? So that's what we call an association. Very interesting. But they took it a step further with that study and looked at, okay, well, why could that be? And they showed that people who had more citrus fruits in their diet also had increased levels of F. praunitzii, so a type of microbe or a group of microbes that we know have a role in things like neurotransmitters, so things like serotonin and dopamine. So there's that really nice mechanism there that's, starting to open up our minds. And of course, we need to now take it to the next stage of doing an intervention study where we actually give people citrus fruit on the daily and see how that improves, their mental health. But I think, as a protective mechanism, 20% lower risk, it's a delicious way to, start to think about improving your mental health or looking after your mental health.
I love that. Eat a satsuma a day for a potential 20% lower risk of depression. Very cool. Megan, that leads me on to a question about psychobiotics. I've seen a lot about psychobiotics. What are they? What's the mechanism? What are you excited about with them?
Yeah, another kind of buzzword, like we've got the prebiotics, the probiotics, and now the psychobiotics. So psychobiotics essentially are types of microbes, types of probiotics that are thought to have mental health benefits, right? So in terms of the literature, there has been quite a few different clinical trials. In fact, I think close to 20 different kind of high quality clinical trials looking at can specific types of bacteria, we call them strains, have mental health benefits. So they've taken people with depression or anxiety and they've given them specific strains. Now, overall, when we look at the whole body of evidence, which is what we do in terms of a systematic review. So the systematic reviews essentially bring together all of the individual studies. So you look at what the whole body of evidence is saying, instead of just looking at individual studies, which can be a little bit biased, right? And what the systematic reviews have suggested is that perhaps certain types of microbes may actually have a role in managing things like depression. But what I would say in terms of clinical practice, the jury is still very much out in terms of the right type of bacteria, the right dose, the right population, because obviously, depression is very heterogeneous. So in terms of, I guess, my clinical advice, there might be something coming in the future around specific types of strains of bacteria that can have these benefits, but actually we've got probably more robust evidence around whole dietary approaches for improving and supporting mental health, including depression. So I would probably recommend going down that route at the moment because it's strongest evidence.
And that's super six, eating legumes, eating nuts.
Yeah, so in particular, there was this really fantastic landmark study called the SMILES trial. It was from many years ago now, but they've had supporting studies kind of reinforce that this is a real thing. And essentially, people who had mild to moderate depression went on either this kind of gut-boosting Mediterranean diet, like I said, the super six, extra virgin olive oil, fermented dairy, some oily fish in there, or a befriending type of counselling. And what they showed is those who had were in the diet group after 12 weeks, and I think it was important they had the befriending counselling because they wanted to make sure any benefit in the diet wasn't because they were seeing, the research dietitian. So same number of contact sessions, etc. Really nicely controlled study. And they showed those in the diet group had I think it was 32% of them had a significant improvement in their depression scores, which would have classified them as no longer clinically depressed. In the control group, that was around 8%. Now, I always make the disclosure whenever I'm reporting that study is that everyone stayed on their antidepressant medication. So no one should ever, go cold turkey for, this new way of eating. But I certainly know that like in clinic, it can be really empowering for people who are still struggling. They might be on medications and they need that extra support. And certainly people maybe with, lower or earlier stages depression, before they go on medication, starting to really think about how they're nourishing those microbes. And in turn, maybe, that can help support their therapy.
Megan, obviously one massive factor in how good we all feel is sleep. And I know that there's a link between poor sleep and how your microbiome is kind of working. At the same time, of course, there are certain groups of people who, their sleep just isn't going to be amazing for a while. Let's say parents of new babies, you're going to be back in that group soon. What can you do if, hey, you're worried about the impact of poor sleep on your microbiome, but the reality is you're not going to be getting a solid 8 hours anytime soon?
Absolutely, Claudia. I mean, like I said, I've been in the trenches twice, about to go on the third time. Also things like, going through perimenopause where the night flushes, shift working. There's a lot of people, who go through different stages of life or different scenarios where, someone saying to them, sleep more is the most infuriating thing because you're like, it's outside of my control, right? So I was very excited when I saw research suggesting actually it's not just sleep impacting our gut health, but actually our gut health may impact our sleep. So it's bi-directional, right? So we do know that after around 3 days of disturbed sleep, our microbes start to kind of become a little bit more pro-inflammatory, right? But what some researchers did is they then tried to understand the bidirectional relationship. So why is this actually happening? And what they did is they took people who were sleep deprived and they transplanted the microbiome, so through a fecal transplant, which is a really mechanistic but really exciting way to try to understand what might be happening, into mice. And they showed those mice who had the sleep-deprived microbiome actually started to exhibit things like cognitive decline and brain inflammation, which we experience when we are sleep-deprived. Yet the mice that received the microbiome from non-sleep-deprived people actually didn't have those sorts of side effects of the cognitive decline. So actually it looks like one of the mechanisms of why we feel quite bad when we haven't had enough sleep and we're not functioning could be via the microbiome. So for anyone out there who's like, okay, well, I can't focus that much on the sleep strategies at the moment, thinking about your diet. So getting in those super six, thinking about some fermented foods and looking at how that potentially could actually improve your sleep quality. So you might still only have, 4-hour slots at a time, but actually that might, like I said, improve, the depth of the sleep and how rested you feel after.
And fermented food, we're talking kefir, we're talking miso.
Yep, kimchi, sauerkraut, those sorts of things. And there was a really great study from Stanford University, which actually showed that people who went on a high fermented food diet not only had an increase in microbial diversity, so the number of different types of microbes in their gut, which essentially we use as a bit of a marker of gut health at the moment, but also had a decrease in some markers of inflammation in their body. So I'm a big fan of fermented foods. If you're kind of freaked out, like, oh, the flavor's a bit too much, then, things like live yogurt and aged cheeses are also types of fermented foods. So you can start there and your taste buds start to kind of adapt. And actually, now I crave kimchi with my eggs every morning.
And permission to eat good quality cheese. Love to hear it. Megan, I just want to pick back up on you mentioned when we were talking about sleep, about hormones and perimenopause and these kind of big hormonal changes in people's lives. We're learning a lot now about the links between, hormones and the gut, right? Can you tell us something about could managing your gut health help with PMS symptoms or with perimenopause symptoms or, other big hormonal kind of switch-ups?
Yeah, look, I think there's a whole lot of really empowering research coming out, particularly for women, but not just women. We're looking at also the microbes' role in things like testosterone regulation and stuff like that. But most of the research so far is very much focused on the regulation of estrogen, for example, from our gut microbes. So essentially, there is these groups of microbes. Remember, our gut microbiome is these trillions of microbes, right? Now, there's a group called the estrobolome, another fancy word. So the estrobolome are these microbes that have been able to essentially turn inactive estrogen into active estrogen. So when our body produces estrogen, it uses it, then it gets old and it dumps it into the gut. Now, normally we would then pass that out through a stool sample. But if you've got those right types of microbes, the estrobolome turns it from inactive estrogen back to active estrogen and we reabsorb it. Right? So there has been quite a number of observational studies coming out now highlighting that, for example, if you eat more plants and have a higher, fiber diet, actually some of the menopausal symptoms like hot flushes seem to be reduced. So that's kind of one area where I think it can be really empowering for women who feel very disempowered, not able to control their symptoms. And then, like you said, PMS, lucky us females again. So yeah, there's again been really great research, a lot of it observational, but again showing that women who have more like carotenoid rich vegetables, so things like the orange ones, right? Those women seem to have around a 40% lower risk of having painful periods, right? Other studies have shown that women who have less than 2 pieces of fruit a day also seem to have, higher rates of painful periods. So there's quite a lot of associations coming through, and we know that, there's a lot of gut symptoms that people experience throughout the different cycle stages, and that's because we not only have, different nutrient receptors in our 9-meter digestive tract, but we also have receptors for things like estrogen and progesterone. So as they change, our gut movements change. So people might experience at some stage are more prone to things like constipation, other times it's more prone to diarrhea. Then there are things like, for example, we know like having too much caffeine and spicy food and high fatty food can exacerbate looser stools. So actually reducing them down during that time of your periods can be helpful.
It's fascinating. Of course, as we all know, in the health word, fasting is such a topic at the minute. What is the link between fasting and gut health? Can fasting be beneficial for gut health?
There's so much hype, right? And there's so many different types. And I guess in terms of gut health, we know that, there's decent kind of evidence to suggest that fasting, between 12 and 14 hours overnight, while we're sleeping, it's probably a beneficial thing to do for our gut lining because it allows that time for our gut cells to regenerate, the gut movements like the migrating motor complex to kind of push through any little bits of food that have been left through. So that sort of level of fasting. But anything outside of that or more extreme than that, in terms of gut health, there really hasn't been any kind of robust science that's convinced me. In fact, I think we need to be quite cautious, or if you are going down the fasting route, which, I appreciate a lot of people do for various reasons like weight management, you still need to be careful to have sufficient dietary fiber, that 30 grams to really nourish your microbiome. So when we eat fiber, which comes from all our different super six, the plant foods, most of fiber digestion happens in the last 1.5 meters of your 9-meter digestive tract because of the microbes are there. They have the enzymes, they break it down, they produce all these amazing, quite powerful chemicals. People are starting to hear things like short-chain fatty acids and butyrate, that are kind of like these chemical messengers throughout the body to kind of help regulate our appetite and our blood sugars and our mental health and that sort of stuff. So that's why fiber is so important, yet it's so underrated, right? Because if you're not getting your 30 grams of fiber, you're essentially starving your microbiome, and therefore it's not able to be this really impressive army to look after you if it's not on its A game and not well fed. So when you are going through these fasts, the different types of fasts, you still need to make sure you're feeding your microbiome. And there has been some studies in animals, so disclosure there, but they've shown that extended fasts in animals, what happens is those microbes essentially get hangry, just like humans get hangry, right? And they start to eat away at the mucus lining. Because in our gut lining, we've got like a nice thick mucus layer which kind of protects, the more sensitive immune system from any of the things passing through. But the microbes start to eat away at that because they're so hungry. And that then kind of makes your immune system more vulnerable to being triggered.
Something else, Megan, people might think about if they're, they want to be healthier and happier is they're going to start exercising more, right? Gut and exercise. On the one hand, it feels like exercise is fantastic for your gut health. On the other hand, people, especially runners, people that do HIIT, these kinds of intense exercises, also report gut symptoms which are not especially nice. How do we tread the balance between a happy gut and one that isn't giving us nasty symptoms when it comes to exercise?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, right? Because we know that people who exercise, independent of what they're eating, actually have better gut health, more diverse ranges of microbes. So yes, it is hugely beneficial. But like you said, there are a lot of people who, if they're doing really intense exercise like long durations of HIIT, for example, or marathon runners, they can, report higher gut issues. And essentially that's because when you are doing, intense exercise or long duration, a lot of the blood diverts away from your gut and therefore to, feed the muscles because they're working extra hard. But then your gut doesn't necessarily get the oxygen that it needs and can get a bit starved, right? And we know that things that can exacerbate that kind of starvation of your gut and therefore more likely to have gut issues as a result of these intense exercises or long durations is an untrained gut, right? So if you want to go for do a marathon and you don't put in the hard yards of the training, you just decide to rock up on the day and go hard, you're probably going to have a worse gut as a result of that. High temperatures, if you're in 30-degree heat, really exercising really hard, again, that can make your gut more vulnerable to things like gut permeability, which essentially is, if you're thinking of your gut lining, quite like a very strong, very switched on kind of tube, which only allows certain things from your gut into your blood system, because you don't want things floating in your blood system that shouldn't be there. But gut permeability essentially means your gut's a little bit leaky. Which means that things that normally should just stay in your gut gets into your blood system and can create inflammation and stuff like that. So if you're exercising in really hot temperatures for long durations, again, that can exacerbate gut issues in those scenarios. And then there's also dehydration. Again, you need to make sure you're well hydrated. And there's been some studies suggesting that train your gut to have nutrition during, particularly like marathons, for example. Now, we're not talking about these elaborate meals during a marathon, but like quick, rapidly digested. So certain types of like simple carbohydrates can really help, again, make sure you're still getting enough blood perfusion to your gut because it's having to work as well without detracting too much from your muscles.
Pack a banana if you're doing a marathon.
Yeah.
Megan, I saw on your socials recently you mentioned that we're finding out a link between gut health and migraine. Could you please just unpick that for us?
Yeah, look, I'm very lucky to not experience migraines, but I certainly have seen people who do, and I think most people probably know someone. They can be really crippling, right? Like it really decreases people's quality of life. So when I saw this new systematic review, it was really exciting to see that we're now starting to investigate the link between migraines and our gut microbes. So I think it included 16 different individual studies, and overall they showed that people who were more susceptible to migraines seemed to have a reduction in the diversity of their gut microbes, and also some types of groups of microbes like bifidobacteria that are associated with more, anti-inflammatory effects. So from that, there is, an association there. And there, since then, has now been studies looking at things like, well, can we intervene on this, like specific types of probiotic strains? Now, again, the jury is still very much inconclusive. So in clinic, I'm not necessarily going to say just, take a specific probiotic strain at the moment, but there has been a few murmurs, and I think we just need to, do additional randomized control trials. And I think in the future, maybe there will be gut intervening studies outside of just eating more different types of plants and fermented foods that might be more targeted to really supporting people struggling with migraines.
Like you say, there's so much more research we need to do in the field of gut health. Gut health is one of these areas that, because it's become such a hot topic, there's heaps and heaps of misinformation just circulating around out there. What are one or two things that are just absolute myths around gut health that you wish you could just dispel?
Yeah, I think one which I'll be definitely talking about at my New Scientist Live talk is around probiotics, because it is such a hot, sexy, topic, right? But this concept that we've been marketed that we should all take a probiotic for our general gut health is completely unscientific, right? So there's never been a scientific study showing that any specific type of strain is going to help with our general gut health. That's where things like the Super 6 and the fermented food comes in. Now, that's not to say probiotics don't work. We've, got clinical guidelines. The World Gastro Organization have guidelines on probiotics, and they give certain indications for specific strains of bacteria that can be really efficacious. So, for example, they've given top-level, level 1 evidence, the World Gastro Guidelines, for taking a specific strain of bacteria called LGG during your antibiotic course, if you are prescribed antibiotics, at a dose of 10 billion twice per day. So I know it sounds quite therapeutic, but that's the way we need to start treating these, probiotics to have any sort of, clinical and meaningful benefit. So don't waste your time or money on these kind of, generic daily probiotics. Get the food in.
Great, thanks, Megan. Linked to that, if you just had like an infinite money pot for research, what would you be absolutely desperate to research in this area? Have you got any hypotheses that are lurking?
I mean, so our team at King's has just finished a world-first clinical trial looking at food additives, specifically emulsifiers, in those with Crohn's disease, so a type of inflammatory bowel disease. And for the first time, we showed that what we did, so it was a really well-designed study, so it was a randomized controlled trial. So people had mild to moderate active Crohn's disease, and half of them were on essentially an emulsifier-containing diet, kind of reflecting what they would normally have in the general public. The other half got emulsifier-free diet, right? And they were blinded, so they didn't know which group they were in. It was matched for all the different types of other nutrients and things like that. And what we showed is that those who had the emulsifier-free diet, so low emulsifier diet, they actually had an improvement not only in their disease severity, but also some of their symptoms. So that was, one of the first studies to ever kind of highlight that these food additives, which historically have been approved as, safe, or we classify them as GRAS, so generally regarded as safe, actually might not be that inert when we think about our gut microbiome. Now, of course, that paper is now under review in a scientific journal, so we'll wait to see what comes out there. But I would love to kind of repeat that study in people perhaps who've got genetic susceptibility to Crohn's before they develop it, right? Because we do know that a lot of these inflammatory bowel conditions, they seem to be on the increase, and it's increasing well beyond what genetics could be changing, right? So there's environmental factors, the microbiome's playing a role, and a lot of, patients just report they think there's something in their diet that's triggering a flare. So preventing other people with, in developing inflammatory bowel disease, but also, I guess, in other autoimmune conditions, whether there could be a role for different types of food additives. Because yes, they went through all the safety testing, right? But that was before we understood about the real importance of our gut microbiome. So that's why we conducted the study at King's, and other groups around the world looking at other additives, retesting their safety profile, thinking specifically about how they're impacting our gut microbiome.
So cool. How else do you think that our ever-growing knowledge around the microbiome and around gut health might impact, how we think about our health over the next 5 to 10 years? It feels like we're learning so much stuff that could be really translated to very practical advice for people.
Yeah, it is. It is a really exciting time. And what I foresee is going to happen is we're going to get much more specific with our advice based on the different conditions or life stages. Like we've spoken about, a lot of the basic recommendations for gut health at the moment apply to if you're going through perimenopause or have depression. So it's, the super 6 fermented foods, oily fish, those sorts of things, extra virgin olive oil. Whereas I think in the future, we'll get much more specific. So we'll be like, okay, we want to work on, anxiety for this, this patient, and what specific microbes do we need to feed, and what specific dietary interventions do we need to recommend. So we're certainly not there yet, because there's a lot of commercialized microbiome tests kind of claiming we're there. I wish we were there, honestly, it would make my job much easier. But we just need to do more validation studies to identify specific kind of foods that will change specific types of microbes, and not just the types of microbes, but also their functionality. And that, I could probably ramble about this all day, but I think an important thing is that identical bacteria can act very different in different people's guts based on the environment and what they're feeding them. So just knowing what type of bacteria you have in your gut doesn't necessarily give you the full picture at the moment. We want to understand what chemicals they're producing and what they're doing in your body.
You touched on, Megan, there's all these tests floating around. There's lots of big claims around what we can learn about our health and our bodies. What are some red flags you would caution the audience to look out for when it comes to claims around gut health and health more broadly?
Yeah, I think when it sounds too good to be true. I think, one of the safety nets I always say to people, if they are being sold, a new eating plan or a test or a supplement, is ask that company, has there been a randomized controlled trial, ideally placebo controlled, because we know if you think you're doing something good for your body, then up here, that can actually change your outcomes, reported outcomes. So I always like the placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials showing that this specific intervention or the formulation that they're trying to sell you has got the specific benefit you want. If there hasn't been a randomized controlled trial, I say, look, probably save your money, look for something there has been a randomized controlled trial, right? Because there will be, thousands of different interventions one person can trial. It could take, 50 years to get through them all. So you may as well focus on the ones where there is some science there with a randomized controlled trial showing that benefit.
Thanks, Megan. Last thing I will ask you is, what is one, your kind of main health, well-being, happiness tip you would give to people when it comes to health, to gut health and nutrition?
I'm going to be a real nerd and just share something that I personally do, but I think it's a mindset change that has really helped me just really embrace nourishing my microbes. So every time I eat something, could be at the cinema, it could be, for dessert, I think, okay, I want something for my taste buds, right? Because food should be a joy, but I want to make sure I'm also feeding this army or this pet or whatever, like this super universe that I know that if you nourish right, will look after you. It will, help with your hormones, it will help with your mental health, all of these sorts of things if you just start to look after it. So yeah, every mouthful I think, okay, what's in it for my microbes?
Megan, Rossi, thank you so much for joining us today.